What I want to pick up for the next 10 minutes is to look at financing around infrastructure projects, and particularly how that interacts with the delivery and the modes of delivery, and how the public and private sector can interact in terms of private sector participation. So just to give a little bit of context, in terms of infrastructure demand and why it's there, I mean, we know about economic growth pushes the amount of infrastructure required. Population growth, moving towards urban populations, but also the technology side, the environmental side pushes, and the requirements within the city and within public sector policies drives infrastructure investment that is creating this huge demand. Of course, the big issue is how you pay for it. But if you look at urbanization, and I think it's about 1 million people a day are moving to cities around the world, which is great, but it creates huge demand on infrastructure. Why should the public sector be involved in that? First of all, there's about citizen delivery and looking after the citizens and making sure that they have the required minimum level of infrastructure. But if we look at some of the stats here in terms of from traffic congestion, water shortage, power shortage, the economic impact, which impacts on taxation, which impacts on the growth of an economy, is driven and negatively by lack of infrastructure. Now the challenge is, how do you convert the potential for this, not losing this economic impact, into the finance required to deliver the infrastructure? The important bit is, first of all, to understand who's involved. So you have to have government. You have to deliver to the citizen. But you're also, in terms of industry and now, particularly around smart cities, academia is becoming more important in terms of the financing and the delivery. So understanding how they interact with public sector delivery is very important. So when we look at cities and how they interact, we put the objectives in the centre, and that's driven by public sector. So economic competitiveness, sustainability, quality of life, what's driving for the citizen and those living in the cities. And then our next ring is around infrastructure. And while that's the narrative there is around the technology piece, there's the hard infrastructure and then the soft IT bits, cybersecurity, making sure it's safe and active for the citizens. And until you have all of that, so you know what you want to do, you know how you're going to deliver it from an infrastructure point of view, then you can start dealing with the economy piece, the mobility, how that's all going to change and how that's going to impact on the citizen. But you have to engage with the citizen as well to understand and be transparent, include them in that decision making to ensure that you're delivering what is required and ultimately a successful city. So how does all that link in with finance? Well, busy slide, but what the way we look at it is there is a huge amount of money in the world that's looking for infrastructure projects. There's a huge demand across the world for infrastructure. The problem is some of the public and private sector don't always speak the same language. And what happens typically is you've got this pet project that probably isn't suitable for private sector, and public sector says, do you know what, we're going to run a PPP. That's what I've heard that somewhere. I've been at a conference and I've heard that. So we jump straight from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, and we go with it. We've got our structure, we've got our decision made, and we are going with a PPP. And generally that fails. So the way we try and look at it is we say, start at your top left. Understand the business model. Understand what you're trying to deliver and all of the number bits behind that. I know it's a bit boring and certainly in terms of how it could be portrayed, but you then understand, is there a funding gap? Is there enough money there? Is there that I can generate from somebody else that doesn't need to be paid by the public sector? Is there potential for risk transfer? Can I push some risk to somebody else so that I, as the public sector, don't need to retain that? And there's a value on that. But the important bit is that you don't push too much, because otherwise it won't be taken. So you try and push the risk to those who's best able to manage it. And then you say, well, are there returns available? Because the private sector is driven differently to the public sector. It's looking for financial returns. So it needs to know that there's enough money coming in that's greater than the costs of what's going out. Now, if they don't do it efficiently, that's their problem. They'd lose their returns. But they need to start off on the right basis. The other bit we look at is understanding value. And if you invest, I talked about the economic gains that are there, and they're challenging in terms of how you monetize that. But you know you need the infrastructure to deliver that. But there are far more closer routes to value. And we look at it in terms of direct and indirect, particularly for projects. And so direct is, if I invest in infrastructure here, is there a value uplift in perhaps the land that that I as public sector own, and therefore there's a value uplift, and therefore directly I receive that? Or is there an indirect way where I put in a light rail system into a city, and I put it through a piece of land that I don't own? But the value, as Gabriel talked earlier, the value increases for everybody who owns the land around that. So how do I capture some of that value? Because I've made money for them as the public sector, because I've put a station there that brings lots of people. I'm going to sell lots of houses. So do I charge taxes? Do I charge rates? Do I want to do that at all? But that's a public policy decision. And the last bit is asset recycling. So separate to the projects, public sector owns lots of assets that maybe it doesn't need to. Maybe it doesn't need to actually own it. But there's also a lot of money around the world that would like to own it and would like to have the public sector as a tenant, or maybe better able to manage it and do it more cost effectively. So is there a way of creating structures where you involve the private sector and maybe up to privatization, maybe sell these assets? Do you really need to own them? So when we do all of this and we assess that, then we know how much money might be available in the pot. What's the best way of doing this? And then we start saying, well, who should we go and get the money from? Is it all public sector? Is it private sector, the banks, the equity? But there's also new ways around that. So you've got export credit, go for it to Asia, there's lots of contractors bringing money, there's supplier money, there's vendor money, lots of ways in terms of getting finance into projects. The bit is you've got to have done the maths beforehand to make sure it works. And it's only when you've done all of that, then you know how you might actually procure it and deliver this. So is it purely public sector? Can you do a joint venture, or do you go all the way to privatization? But there's a lot of work to get all the way through. And to my point early on, you don't just straight jump to what my best delivery option is. And in our minds, and we've done this many times, that's how you deliver the best project. You get the public and private sector involved more and more, working together to deliver on those original objectives that sit in the middle of the city. And just one last bit that will drive some of the discussion, but so smart cities is one of the things, subjects that's driving the world at the moment in terms of cities and infrastructure. One of the interesting points is a lot of it, the public sector investment needs to be a catalyst, and it has been in certain cases. And one example, if you look at the US, Columbus, Ohio won the Department of Transportation grant for smart cities, $40 million. They've now converted that and leveraged that up, that they now have a couple of $100 million using a mix of called public-private partnership, private sector participation, but also getting corporates to come in and support various initiatives that are being done around that. So again, by putting together the right mechanism, by putting together the right, understanding the various elements of it, you do end up delivering a great city. Thank you very much.